Hello, and today we're going to be reviewing the HART HPRS50 20-volt brushless one-handed reciprocating saw. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, first up we have the battery slot. The battery slot is located on the rear of the tool and will accept any of HART's 20-volt batteries. Overall, the slot is fairly well designed. There is a little bit of looseness or play, but there isn't a whole lot, and I don't have any worries or concerns about the battery falling free or falling off, and they did the right thing with orienting it so that the battery can't fall directly downward unless the tool's operating upside down. So everything on the battery slot is good, and I don't really have any complaints. Now, battery life on this particular tool is fairly good. It's using a brushless motor, and the motor is requiring quite a bit of power because this saw does have a lot of power, but the battery life is fairly good. But if you have an especially large project you are working on, I would recommend having two 4 amp hour batteries minimum. But at the end of the day, for most small projects, one battery will be more than enough. So with that being said, everything here is, well, just fine. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the grips. Now the grips on this particular tool are quite nice. It features plenty of rubberized texture on the top, on the bottom, and along the sides, and there are plenty of places for you to be able to hold on to the saw with both your hands. But this is a one-handed reciprocating saw, so what about the rear grip? How's the rubberized texture there? Well, I am pleased to report that the rear grip is, well, just about as perfect as you can get on a one-handed reciprocating saw. There's plenty of rubberized texture and grooves and indentations and little raised ridges, and it is, well, not too thick or too bulky. It's just about the right size for a one-handed reciprocating saw, and it is fairly easy to maneuver the saw one-handed. So if you need to use your other hand to hold whatever you're cutting, or just on the front of the saw if you have an especially hard cut, everything is, well, just right in my opinion. Quite frankly, I'm very happy with the overall grips on this particular tool, and the ergonomics are quite good. It's fairly well balanced, but if you are using a smaller battery on the back, it's a little front heavy, but other than that, it's a pretty good showing. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the trigger and safety, and it's a pretty good showing here. Both the trigger and safety are both made out of plastic, the trigger being made out of a black plastic, and the safety being made out of a blue plastic. The safety works as, pretty much all safeties do. You push it all the way to one side, it turns on. You push it all the way to the other side, it turns off. So, it's a pretty simple setup. Really no complaints there. It feels a little bit plasticky, but it doesn't really affect the overall operation of the tool, so, I'm giving it a pass. The trigger is completely smooth. I wish there were some sort of indentation grooves on the trigger, but it's still completely functional and it works just fine. Now when it comes to the variable speed nature of the trigger, it is very, very good. In fact, it's one of the best variable speed triggers I have seen. There's plenty of ramp up speed, and there's plenty of slow speeds, there's plenty of fast speeds, and of course everything in between. So quite frankly, it's a very good showing, and I really wish that more brands did this good of a job with just their variable speed motors or triggers on their products. So at the end of the day, I think HART did a very good job with the trigger on this particular saw. The safety feels a little bit plasticky, but is completely functional and doesn't really affect the overall performance of the tool, and everything here is completely acceptable or very, very good. So I think it's a good showing. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the blade release and blade clamp, and this is another pretty good showing, but it's not my personal preference when it comes to the blade release, at least. The blade release is going to be a blue side style flip up release lever, and it works. You just have to hope you never get the inner shaft or the blade clamp shaft misaligned with the lever, because if that happens, then you have to manually bend the shaft back in place in order for you to get the blade out. It's just the whole thing. So this isn't my preferred setup, but it works just fine, and as long as you're not abusing the tool, that shouldn't be an issue. But like I said, it works just fine. I personally prefer having the blade release being a, twist style on the shaft itself. It's a little bit more, stuff at the front of the tool, but, I personally prefer that versus, not being able to put a new blade in the tool. As you can tell from the video, you can see the little mechanism pushing down on the blade clamp in order for you to pull the blade out, and then you'll have to push it down in order to insert a blade, so, it doesn't stay open. You'll have to pull the lever each and every time. So, it's an old school blade clamp release. It's not super old. You don't need a tool in order to change the blade, but it's not the newest and greatest on the market. Now the blade lever itself is just fine. The blade clamp does a good job of holding onto the blades. I haven't had this particular tool drop any blades I've used it. I've used it with some large pruning blades as well as metal cutting blades and just general purpose blades, and in all scenarios the blade clamp has done an excellent job of, well, hanging on the blades and not accidentally releasing them. So I haven't had any issues with blade clamp failure, so it's a pretty good showing. So with that being said, let's go ahead and move on. Okay, next up we have the LED light, and you know, it's an okay performance. It's not super bright, but it definitely helps, and it can actually get the light in front of the tool, unlike a certain circular saw I reviewed a couple of weeks ago, and it seems to be doing a fairly good job at, well, you know, just helping you get your job done in a dark environment. I personally would have preferred it to be a little bit brighter, but you know, it is what it is, and it does help. So, you know, not the best, not the worst. It does feature an afterglow setting, which means the light will stay on for about, you know, 10 to 15 seconds after you release the trigger, and for the most part, you know, it's a pretty average showing here. So, you know, I am grateful there's a light there. I wish it was a little bit brighter, but hey, it's better than nothing, and it's better than some other lights on some other tools I've reviewed. So, you know, it's an okay showing. Moving on. Okay, next up we have the shoe, and the shoe it's pretty average. You know, there really isn't anything special about it. You can't adjust it forward, you can't adjust the length, the pivoting, you know, action on it isn't really that great. You know, about as far forward as it'll go is what you'll see in the video. You know, it's a little bit stiff when you first get it, it loosens up, it's painted black, the paint scratches off, you know, it's all pretty standard. There really isn't anything special about it, but you know, it gets the job done, and in operations I haven't had any issues with it. So, you know, no ugly surprises. You know, it's a metal shoe that's been painted, that's not adjustable. That's about it. Moving on. Okay, now the tool weighs 3.84 pounds without a battery. Now you're going to have to take my word, because I still have not been able to figure out what happened to my scale. And the other scale I'm using just has a bad screen, and my camera angle was not properly set up, which is still my fault, but I'm being lazy and not reshooting the shot, so I apologize. So with that being said, what else can I say about this tool? Oh yeah! And with a 4 amp hour battery, it weighs 5.20 pounds. So, you know, it's not the lightest, but, you know, it's not the heaviest either. Moving on. Okay, let's talk a little bit about the saw in use. And I have to say, I was very impressed with how well this particular saw works. HART doesn't do the whole, you know, HP batteries, or, you know, the whole, you know, 3 different kinds of batteries, even though they're all 18-volt batteries, they just have different discharge rates thing. And pretty much any battery you stick in this is going to be just fine. Of course, you want to use larger, you know, 4 or 6 amp hour batteries, but, you know, as long as you're using the proper size battery, you shouldn't have any major issues while using this particular tool. Now, this tool does get warm after a while of, you know, using it, like all tools. And in cold temperatures, you're going to get a much longer runtime than in warmer temperatures, where it's going to get to a point where you will need to let the saw, you know, rest and cool off. You know, a portable fan will help with that, but you know, in cooler temperatures, I was able to cut down multiple branches and trees on a single battery without having to let the tool rest, because it didn't get hot enough to, well, need a rest. Now, something to keep in mind when you are using a reciprocating saw, you know, people who use reciprocating saws all the time know this, but you always need to keep the saw pressed as tight as you possibly can against whatever you're cutting to minimize the vibrations. If your saw is just vibrating, then all that energy is not going into, well, making the cut, it's going to vibrating the branch. So in order to stop that, you need to try to minimize how much the object you're cutting can vibrate. So, you know, as long as you keep that in mind, this particular saw can actually make quite good time, and I was very happy with the overall performance of this particular saw in use. And it did work on pretty much any material I tried to cut with it, as long as it was, you know, as long as you have reasonable expectations. It was able to cut through this thin, you know, yard furniture piping frame material just fine. You know, I was able to make multiple cuts, and it did just fine. Didn't have any issues. You know, it takes a little while, but of course this will also depend on how new your blade is. The blade I was using here is a little bit old, and if I had had a newer blade, it would have been able to make the cut much quicker. So, you know, it's doing a fine job with wood, it's doing a fine job with metal. I used it to cut some plastic vinyl fencing, and it did a good job with that material as well. So, you know, pretty much any material I used it on, it was doing a good job. I did at one point try cutting through some old welds, but that material was just far too hard for a reciprocating saw, and if I wanted to really, you know, cut through those old welds, I would need to probably use a grinder. So, you know, as long as you have reasonable expectations, this particular reciprocating saw is actually quite good. I do think that this is probably one of my best one-hand reciprocating saws. You know, I have the newer Ryobi one, and I have the older Ryobi one, and this thing is definitely better than the older Ryobi one-handed reciprocating saw. The newer Ryobi one-handed reciprocating saw is probably on par, or maybe a little bit better, but as far as, you know, just the capabilities of this particular saw, as far as that goes, it's an excellent tool, and I really don't have any complaints about it in use, and I think it does an excellent job. So, you know, I'm pretty impressed with its capabilities, and that's about it. So let's recap the pros and cons, and then I'll give you my final verdict on this particular saw. And the first pro is powerful. This particular saw has plenty of power, and I haven't had any issues in operation of where the motor stops or the blade stops going back and forth and the motor just freely spins and doesn't actually cut anything. Quite frankly, I'm very impressed with the amount of power that this saw is delivering, so in my opinion, this is a pro. Trigger. The trigger on this particular reciprocating saw is actually very, very good. In fact, I wish more triggers on the market were like this particular trigger. It has plenty of ramp up speed, there's slow speeds, there's fast speeds, there's everything you want and everything you need in between. So the trigger is excellent on this particular product. Grips. Overall, the grips on this particular tool are very good. The ergonomics are comfortable and easy to work with. They're not too thick or too narrow, so in my opinion, this is a pro. Battery life. Considering how much power this particular tool has, it actually does have quite a good battery life. Now, it's not going to be the longest running tool on the market because the motor's so powerful, but at the same time, considering what you're getting, I'm very impressed with just how long the battery did last. LED. Having the LED is a nice feature. It's not the brightest, but it does, serve a purpose. It is helpful, and, there are other brands that don't have them, so, I'm pretty happy with the performance, even if it is a little bit on the dim side. Okay, and our first and only meh would be the blade release, and this is more of a personal preference. I personally prefer the twist style blade release versus the lever style, so, like I said earlier, it's a personal preference, but that's why it's on the meh list. And the first con would be heavy. Now, it's not super heavy, but for a one-handed saw, it's definitely a little bit on the heavier side. It's definitely much heavier than the one-handed skill reciprocating saw I've previously reviewed, and it's also heavier than my Ryobi one-handed brushless reciprocating saw, the original one. The newer one, I think, is actually probably about the same weight. So, it's just something that you should be aware of. And that is it for the pros and cons. Final thoughts on this particular saw. Overall, I really like this particular saw. It doesn't really have any major shortcomings that I was able to find, and it worked great in operation. I didn't have any issues with it dropping blades, it had plenty of power, didn't have any issues with the motor stopping, and the battery life was fairly good. It is a tad on the heavy side, but it has more than enough power to make up for that, so this particular saw is actually, I think, a very good tool. Now, when it comes to my recommendation for the saw, it comes highly recommended. I think it's an excellent saw. If you can find it. What I've been noticing lately is a lot of HART products are becoming kind of hard to find, and unfortunately I'm becoming a little bit suspicious of their future availability in Walmart stores. Now, I recently went to a whole bunch of Walmart stores, and what I've noticed is a lot of the HART sections seem to be getting smaller and a different tool brand getting larger, and that other tool brand would be, well, Walmart's other store brand tool, HyperTough. I've been seeing more and more HyperTough tools and HyperTough branded tools in their tool section and less HART branded tools, and it's also been quite a while since HyperTough released a new, since HART released a new tool. HyperTough has been releasing new tools left and right, and so I'm wondering if Walmart is planning on ditching HART. The other weird thing is you can now purchase HART tools directly from HART. But I always thought HART was its own brand, and the only place you could buy HART tools was from Walmart. So I'm not sure if HART spun off into its own entity, if it was just another company and they had some sort of licensing agreement with Walmart, and now they're just going out on their own and Walmart's slowly giving them the axe. Whatever the case may be, I really hope Walmart doesn't actually end up dumping HART, because one of the reasons why I bought into the HART system is I like the convenience of just being able to go to Walmart and pick up a HART tool if I need one. So, I think it would be a huge mistake if Walmart was to ditch HART. I think if they're planning on replacing it with HyperTough, that would make me a very, very unhappy individual. And quite frankly, I think it would be a huge mistake because I don't think the HyperTough tools are quite as reliable as the HART tools are. So, it's just something that you should be aware of. Now, like I said earlier, you can buy this particular saw from the HART retailer that's, separate from Walmart, and you may be able to find this particular saw in one of your local Walmart stores, but currently it is sold out online as of January 2026. So, something that you should just keep in mind if you are planning on purchasing this saw. You may want to do it sooner than later because there's a chance that, it may disappear from the Walmart shelves. Now, I could be completely wrong about this as well, but it is interesting that, Walmart doesn't seem to be giving HART much love lately, and it definitely appears now that they're starting to stock some of the, spring/summer stuff in the Walmarts now that most of the holidays are over, that, a lot of stuff that are ending up in the, lawn and garden center where the outdoor power tools that used to be comprised majority of, HART and HyperTough now seems to be made up of Greenworks and HyperTough. So, a little bit odd there. So with that being said, let's, end this video. If you liked it, please like and subscribe, and we'll see you all next time. God bless.